Good morning. Good morning, family, friends, and those curious what we all have been up to for the past semester. For whatever reason you're joining us this morning, we're glad you're here, and we're excited to share some insight into the journey we joyfully embarked on 3.5 months ago.
We left EMU on January 12th.
We returned on April 30th.
In that period of 108 days,
We attempted to learn 3 languages.
we read 44 books.
We ate 24.5 jars of peanut butter and 1,513 pieces of falafel.
We saw 5 rainbows in one day, we braved a dust storm, had some outdoor landing in hail, and now have 1 lightning strike survivor among us.
Collectively, we vomited 60 times.
We lost 3 passports.
We found 4 passports.
We visited 60 biblical sites and were led by 14 different guides.
We purchased a grand total of 72 scarves and ripped 16 pairs of pants.
61 pictures of cats were posted on the EMU cross-cultural Instagram page.
A third of us came home with a new tattoo or piercing.
We slept in 33 beds.
We used 8 different currencies.
We walked 41 million meters, or 23,295 miles.
We logged over 139 hours of bus travel, one of 9 total methods of transportation.
And as a whole, we visited 13 countries, including free travel, as visualized by the map above.
When we say we went to the Middle East, that's a pretty broad category, and it still doesn't include all of the places we saw. So to help you get a sense of where we've been for the past 108 days, we put together a map of 108 places we went, including some visited by small groups during our free travel. Here we go. Cairo, Giza, Anaphora, Luxor, St. Catherine's, Mount Sinai, Taba, Eilat, Aqaba, Wadi Rum, Dana, Finan, Petra, Wadi Musa, Amman, Madabat, Mount Nebo, Beit Sahur, Bethlehem, Beit Jala, Hebron, Taiba, Jifna, Ramallah, Herodian, Batir, Dahesha, Wadi Kelt, Jericho, Nablus, Jerusalem, Nebi Samuel, Gibeah, Sataf, Beit Shemesh, Azekah, Ashkelon, Beersheba, Abdat, the Super Bowl, Arad, Masada, Ein Gedi, Qumran, Caesarea Maritima, Mount Carmel, Megiddo, Jezreel, Ein Gev, Beit Shan, Hatzor, Dan, Caesarea Philippi, Banyas, Mount Ben-Tal, Hippus, Gergesa, Chorazin, Tel Aviv, Istanbul, Antalya, Fethiye, Kayakoi, Oludeniz, Kash, Budapest, Prague, Vienna, Sofia, Larnaca, Rosh, Tzurim, Efrat, Kfar Etzion, Zikron Yaakov, Haifa, Oranim, Lochamei Hagetaot, Akko, Usfia, Kfar Yehoshua, Tamra, Nazareth, Sepphoris, Cana, Ilania, Arbel, Magdala, Capernaum, Athens, Piraeus, Aegina, Agia Marina, Perdica, Mount Oros, Corinth, Patras, Bari, Rome, Konya, Lake Garda, Naples, Verona, Cinque Terre, Pescara, Florence, Milan, Venice, and Harrisonburg. So now that you've seen where we've gone, let's take a closer look at what we did there, starting in Egypt.
We left the States after saying our goodbyes through the snow here at EMU, and almost a day later landed in Cairo, Egypt at night. Our first stop on the semester-long journey that saw us through the entire list of places on the map and pretty much everywhere else in between. The first day, we did the ultimate Egypt tourist experience of visiting the pyramids and the Great Sphinx. The next week or so led us through the twisting passages of countless tombs and street markets, both on our own, as well as under the guidance of our EMU group veteran tour guide, Samer. A lot of us were taken by surprise at first, walking through the markets by both the creativity and the perseverance of shop owners convincing us to buy their products. We capped off our time in Egypt with a couple days staying in a 6th century monastery at the base of Mount Sinai. This was where we really began to discuss the biblical portion of our trip, and a number of us came to the conclusion, somewhere along the path, probably somewhere in the 800 steps at the very top of the mountain, that Moses must have been an extraordinarily fit guy for being 80 plus years old. So there we were, huddling and shivering together at the top of the mountain for more than an hour in the cold and wind to see the most beautiful sunset I, as well as many others I'm sure, have ever seen. And we also began our daily routine that you'll probably hear more about later by reading a Bible passage in a place that corresponds to where we were. And from here, following the trail of the ancient Israelites, we made our way from the wilderness of Sinai on into Jordan.
From Egypt, we began our journey by bus across the desert for a few hours until we reached the Israeli border. Here was our first experience crossing a border where Linford and Janet had to give us the rundown of what and what not to say while we were questioned by Israeli soldiers. During this process, they asked us where we came from, what and where we were planning on going, our ethnicity, how many siblings we had, etc. After leaving Egypt, crossing in and out of Israel, and entering Jordan, within a span of an hour, we walked less than a mile and made it into Jordan. The next 10 days or so, a majority of our time was spent hiking through the Jordanian wilderness, making our way from Dana and ending in Petra. Along the way, we had little children and baby goats from Bedouin camps run up to us. Countless cups of sweet Bedouin tea, a camel ride through Wadi Rum, a heart-pounding and adrenaline-filled jeep ride through the desert to our camp, and to top it off, gorgeous views of ruins like Petra. This part of the trip wouldn't have been the same without our two trusty hiking guides, Mahmoud and Mahdi. We ended our time in Jordan, spending our last few days in the capital of Amman, walking through markets, picking up sweet cakes and fresh roasted nuts for a few dinars. As this part of the trip came to a close, we were roughly one-third through and super excited for what awaited us. As we stood on top of Mount Nebo, overlooking the Promised Land and Jericho below us, we were preparing for our 3-week homestays in Palestine. Following the trail of the Israelites, we made our way from the city of Jordan to the West Bank.
After Jordan and Egypt, we went to Israel and Palestine for 2.5 months. We learned about the conflict from all sides, studied the culture, history, and languages of the region. We were showed incredible hospitality during our 3 weeks with Palestinian Arab host families in Beit Sahor. We were also shown incredible hospitality during our days in Israeli settler homes in Efrat. Our biggest focus was on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, usually just called the conflict. We tried to absorb as much information as we could, and at the end we made groups and interpreted it into simple skits. We're going to share those skits and some stories now.
During our time in Israel, we went to a place called a yeshiva, where Jews go to study the Torah and all of its many interpretations. We split into 4 groups and were each accompanied by a student. They told us what they do, but the main focus was asking them any question we could think of. My group sat in the classroom, asked questions, and had great discussions with our guy. We started out curious about the yeshiva and how they study the Torah. People come here for years at a time and study the Torah and the interpretations all day. Made me wonder what it would be like if Christians did a similar thing that intensively. We moved from there into more controversial questions. We ended up having a huge debate on pacifism and what it means, and I had this multiple times with Israeli people. All Israelis serve in the military right after high school, and that really shapes the way that they think, whether they served in a combat position or in volunteer positions across the country. The kids are raised to do this service, and it shapes the way they think, with fear being at the center of this. Fear is huge for the Jewish people. They have been persecuted for hundreds of years, and now that they have a land of their own, they are holding on to it for dear life, paranoid that it could be gone if they let their guard down even for just a few seconds.
Before the sun rose early one morning in Palestine, I took a taxi with a few others to see Checkpoint 300. Our host fathers have to go through it every morning if they work in Jerusalem, only 5 miles away. There were hundreds of people crowded in this narrow cattle chute, waiting their turn to be let through. My host dad told me some mornings the checkpoint is simply closed and he can't get to work that day. I can't imagine going through this every morning.
While we were staying in the Old City of Jerusalem, we met Sarah Israeli, who taught us Hebrew for a week. These lessons were full of songs and rhymes, like Boker Tov, the one we sang while we were coming in. And despite sitting in a room for 4 hours a day, looking at a foreign alphabet, it was actually really fun and interesting. Sarah's a non-religious Jew, and her family has been in Israel for hundreds of years. She had such a passion for teaching Hebrew. She said when she started learning it when she was 6, it was like the alphabet was speaking to her. I honestly don't know how much Hebrew we'll all remember, but I think we'll definitely remember Sarah for a long time.
We had a tour guide named Ayman in Palestine. He said all the right things about showing grace to your enemies and accepting that Jews were there to stay. But there was an anger inside him that was pretty clear. He told me that when he was a child, the Israeli army stopped him and made him pick up their trash. They invaded his home in the middle of the night looking for someone he didn't know. When he was a teenager, he was beaten on the street. When he was an adult, he was arrested several times for nonviolent offenses. Ayman lived a lifetime of being hurt, but he spends every day fighting the instinct to retaliate, and instead is focusing on undermining the system of oppression he's in little by little. It's inspired me to try and do the same.
So when we got to Israel, we visited various different sites, as well as interacted with several different people. The hospitality was unimaginable. But the entire time I was there, I always had the conflict in mind. It was something I was just constantly aware of. But I appreciated that all the people were so open to discussing it. Of course, you got various different perspectives, but in general, everyone was still willing to discuss it with us. Also, now, after experiencing both perspectives, I don't think either side is bad, but in conclusion, I would say I just appreciate the experience as a whole.
My 7-year-old host brother, Jadius, pointed out right there, loved, and I mean loved, to play games with Ben and I. Some of his favorites were hide and seek, or the floor is lava, or Uno. You name it, and he probably wanted to play the game. After we got home from our school days, one of the first things that we would hear is that Jadius wanted to play outside with us. And if for some reason we weren't able to hang out with him for a couple days in a row, Rima, our host grandma, always told us that he really missed us. Yeah, he was a little much to handle sometimes, and there's a slight language barrier between us, but I really miss my little friend.
My host family in Efrat, a Jewish settlement in Israel, taught me a lot about the Jewish perspectives on the land of Israel. I learned how intricate and devoted the Jewish culture is due to its unique customs and traditions such as Shabbat and kosher eating, as well as seeing the importance of participating in that with your surrounding community. My host mom talked to us about the challenges of being a Jew in the American workforce. She needed to get off early every Friday to prepare the home for Shabbat and other Jewish holidays, which is quite a bit of work to put together, along with constantly needing to explain herself to colleagues and bosses as to why she needs off work or can't go hang out on a Friday night. I remember envisioning this sort of lifestyle as she told us these stories, beginning to catch a glimpse of the reasoning behind creating and inhabiting this national home for the Jewish people. Through my family's narratives, I recognize the communal longing for a place where the Jewish identity is understood and appreciated.
During our stay in Palestine, we ventured to many key centers and communities throughout the region. One such location was Nablus, a city famous for kanafa and soap, among other things. While I was super excited to splurge on the cheesy sweets and decadent body cleansers, our visit was filled with mixed emotions for me. My host mom had told us about her oldest son who was snatched in the night by Israeli military. There was no explanation given, no time to understand what was going on. For 6 months, he was held in a Nablus jail with no justification. Although those months held bitter memories, the rich flavor of kanafa provided a sweet escape and simple consolation for her and her husband. But that was in the past. Because of security, my host mom hadn't been allowed back to Nablus in several years. They had gushed about the delicacy so much, dropping little hints along the way. When I inquired as to their desires, there was no answer, only gentle smiles and eyes drawn to the floor in remembrance. I knew what I had to do. Upon returning and handing them the hallowed rich goodness, I had no idea of the weighty response and gratitude that was to follow. The speed and fervor in which they thanked me and ate the treat was almost overwhelming. Never underestimate the power of listening to people's stories and good kanafa.
Alrighty, kids. It's bedtime.
Can we have a story? Story?
Okay.
If we must, okay.
Which one is it?
This one is called Our Home.
A long, long time ago, our people lived on this land.
For a long, long time, our people have lived on this land. They spoke
Hebrew, a once lost language, revived again today.
Arabic, which has withstood the test of time and is still spoken today.
Throughout the years, we have been hurt many times by people who believe we are less than them, which has kept us always on the run.
Over the years, many different people have come and claimed this land. We've never had a place to call our very own. But there is hope that we will continue to live in the land of our ancestors.
But there is hope that our future will continue in the land of our ancestors.
The land where our forefather Abraham proved his faith and Muhammad ascended.
The land where our forefather Abraham proved his faith and the great temple stood. Jerusalem is where we remember. We are finally building our homes in this sacred land.
But now, we're being forced out of this sacred land.
We will do whatever it takes to defend our home.
To fight for our home.
Why are we always fighting?
I think they just don't understand us. But we continue to pray for peace in our homeland.
Wait, but what comes next?
I don't know. But the story's not over yet. Let's go to bed. We'll finish the story another time. Laila Tov.
Leila Saida.
Connection to land. At times during this trip, it seemed like something beautiful. And then sometimes, to my mind that has become very accustomed to Western culture, it felt like I could never understand the suffering that humans are willing to put themselves and others through because of this connection. Throughout the semester, we weren't just learning about modern-day narratives that revolve around land. We were also walking ourselves through the biblical narrative, a history of how the connection to the specific land of Israel-Palestine all started. As we began our trip in Egypt, we imagined the triumph and crippling the fear the Israelites felt escaping the scope of a great empire to forge a new path of monotheism in an unknown promised land that probably felt out of reach. In Jordan, we walked through the vast and unpredictable wilderness, imagining that what it must have been like to wander with a hazy goal. And then we entered into Israel-Palestine, the promised land, where we gradually began to understand just how much these people's lives, and consequently biblical texts, really did revolve around the land.
This was the focus during our time at JUC, Jerusalem University College, where we studied biblical geography and experienced the physical settings of the Promised Land. This included classroom time and exams, but the majority of our time was spent walking on the Mount of Olives, swimming in the Sea of Galilee, and climbing as high as we possibly could in each place in order to point out the mountains, valleys, and ridges. We'd look over the land and identify Mount Gilboa, Mount Tabor, the Shephelah region, and the various routes that we had previously only heard of in Bible stories. JUC's motto, in addition to JUC Tough, which was more of an excuse to pull us off the bus into any kind of weather, hurricanes and hail and rainstorms, was read the land, see the text, live the book. And over the course of our 2 weeks from Dan to Beersheba, the roots of the Bible became evident in the land we were walking on.
Living and learning in the land of Jesus and the prophets was mind-blowing in the way it gave context to the scripture that I'd been reading my entire life. It gave a far greater awareness of the norms of those living in and before the first century and how those norms revealed themselves in the text. Understanding the land is one of the first steps in understanding the people who lived on it. When hiking through the wilderness, which the Israelites wandered for 40 years, I could see how the land would shape the people living in it. David spoke of green pastures in the land of the shepherd, but I only saw the wilderness until we walked down into the wadi, and around the last corner, an explosion of green caught me and the rest of the group by surprise. It gave a new context to what I hadn't realized I hadn't known. Jesus and the prophets taught in parables and rhetoric which reflected the area they lived in to communicate with the people who lived there. The parables they chose reflected the environment they were in. I found myself looking closer at the text of the Bible as I read it, trying to pick out where the authors gave hints at how the land played a role in their decisions and the order of the story.
One morning, we took a bus out to the wilderness, east of Jericho, where the Israelites would supposedly have been wandering at the end of their 40-year-long exile from Egypt. When we arrived and stepped off the bus, our shoes crunched the sandy, rocky earth beneath that covered the ground as far as the eyes could see. All around us were mountains and valleys. We were experiencing the beauty of the desert in springtime, and it was breathtaking. Although this desert was very different from the setting that I pictured Psalm 23 being written in. It was also very different from the setting that I pictured Psalm 23 being written in. The psalm that spoke of God leading his people to green pastures and quiet waters was a landscape rich with green and overflowing with water, or so I thought. But no, looking over the desert in springtime, there was barely any vegetation to be seen. This was a place barren of sustenance, a place of treachery. Even still, it was in this place that the Israelites described their relationship with God as one of deep intimacy. This connection that I made between the land and the text of Psalm 23 required me to reevaluate my understanding of God's purpose in the psalm. With desert imagery in mind, God is giving his people a message that is more difficult to hear. He is saying that he will be exactly what he needs when we need it and nothing more. He does not promise luxury and comfort, but instead his life and his presence. A land flowing with milk and honey is a desert land, a land that is barren and rich, but rich with life.
A few weeks later, we arrived in Nazareth, the hometown of Jesus. While we stayed there, we volunteered at Nazareth Village, a recreation of a first-century village at Jesus' time. As we dressed in the linens and sandals of a first-century Jew, we experienced what life might have been like in Little Nazareth. A few days later, we started hiking the Jesus Trail, a 65-kilometer trail from Nazareth to Capernaum that followed the footsteps of Jesus through the Galilee. The Jesus Trail for many of us was a culmination of the learning and living we had partaken in at JUC and throughout our time in Israel. It was a time of reflection and conversation, of putting what we used to know about Jesus and what we now knew about his life and experiences into the context of our own lives and world today. Walking with Jesus was our second to last stop in Israel. Before we left, we sat in the synagogue one last time.
There, we were wrapping up a huge chunk of our trip, and it was hard to believe that we were actually leaving. Egypt, to the wilderness, to the promised land, and now the beginning of our journey home. We were about to head to Athens and Rome to follow the story of Paul to the nations, and Linford was preparing us for that continued narrative. We were sitting in this first-century synagogue as the people of Nazareth. We had some Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, Herodians, and of course the common people. He was speaking from a paper and let it catch on fire from an oil lamp he had beside him, and most of us were not aware that this was intentional. There was a big panic in the room, as you can expect, and early in the lecture he had told us, when he told us to run, we were supposed to run around crazily and sit in a different seat than we were sitting in. We all ran around the synagogue in quite a ruckus and found different seats all around. We finally settled, and Linford put out the fire, and he used this activity to explain the Holy Spirit coming down and sending people out to spread the gospel. Just as Paul and others went out of the land of Israel to spread the gospel, so are we. We began our journey west with our experiences from the past 2 months in this land in the front of our minds, beginning to think about sharing our story once we get home.
We flew into Athens, a new, slightly uncomfortable place for us right off the bat. But as soon as we began exploring the city, we realized the potential for beauty and adventure that awaited us. We followed in the footsteps of Paul, hitting up the Parthenon and the rest of the Acropolis, the Agora, famous Stoas, the Temple of Hephaestus, the original Olympic game grounds, and many other sites. There are so many stories attached to these places, but I don't have time to get into that. But the gist is this: Paul was surrounded by paganism wherever he went. But interestingly enough, that provided for great opportunities for conversation and relationships. Take Corinth, for example. One of the main temples there was dedicated to Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Even though the Corinthians' idea of love was off due to their worship here and the mindset it created, Paul affirmed them that their choice of love at the center of life was right on, and invited them into God's love. We traveled to Rome by ferry, and already we were embracing the Paul experience again, out on sea. We were used to the European culture, as well as we could be in 5 days, and we enjoyed more free days to explore the cities and the sights. We encountered the Colosseum, the Roman Forum, the Palatine Hill, and many churches, and most of these sites were symbols of power. Rome and its power must have seemed daunting to Paul, because Rome ruled on the basis of fear. But Paul saw the graves of the poor and the rich, and realized that all die. He connected this epiphany to the death of Jesus, which was not final, and the resurrection means life. Paul became unafraid of death. This mindset enhanced his desire to boldly preach the kingdom of God and teachings of Christ without hindrance. He was not intimidated by the shadow of the Palatine Hill and the powerful.
Like Paul led the early church, we had leaders of our own to guide us on this trip. So we'd like to take a few minutes to say thank you and reflect on your contributions. First, we'd like to give a formal thank you to Tristan, our sign language interpreter who traveled with us and never stopped translating our complete buffoonery. You are a gift to us, and I'm so happy to have known you. Please join us in a meditation on the Stutzmans in the style of a Linford birthday ramble speech. Let's look at the bigger picture for a second. We started this trip looking at the plight and the subsequent flight of Hebrews from Egypt. We crossed the Red Sea and were taught about the miracle of Moses parting the waters. When we later crossed the mighty Jordan, we were helped along the way to ensure none of us drowned in its tiny fury. We got confused, we got lost, we got scared, we got distracted by butterflies and rocks alike. And through the whole thing, we had someone to help us ford the treacherous waters of travel. Thank you, Linford, for being your helpful, extra, lively self and teaching us so much, both in the classroom and outside. When we were all at our lowest, when we were tired and drained and completely unable to engage, we know who was there. When a flower was going woefully unnoticed on a hike, We know who was there. When someone needed a mother figure to give medical advice, tell us where to shop, or how to use the bathroom well, we know who was there. One might say she was a giver of life on our trip. One might also know that Jean in Persian means life and soul. So to our ray of sunshine and love, we'd like to give a special thanks to Jeanette. Please come up while Lauren presents your gift.
As a member of the celebration team, I've had the privilege of thanking many people who influenced our group on this trip. But today, on behalf of each one of us, I get to thank and celebrate the two people who impacted us most, our fearless leaders who graciously chose to journey with 26 college students halfway across the world for the 14th time. A constant symbol throughout our journey has been the olive tree, so we thought it would be fitting to end our adventure with one more. Our gift to you is this little olive branch. But just like Linford's birthday speeches, and as Emily exhibited, we have a few more connections to make. In Palestine, the symbol of the olive tree exemplifies strength and resistance. Linford and Janet, you are some of the strongest people we've ever met. The exhaustion and emotional heaviness that this journey can hold doesn't seem to faze you. I think together you have more energy than this entire group combined. You are one of the few strong constants throughout our time, no matter where we are or who we meet. Joy is one of the most evident characteristics in you both. You resist the negativity and pain of the world with inspiring hope, just like the presence of an olive tree, with its roots firmly planted in defiance of the storms around it. Thank you for teaching us true strength and resistance. In Athens, we stood in the middle of the Olympic Stadium and learned about how the first place prize in the early games was an olive wreath and the pride of a race well run. Linford and Janet, you have run this cross-cultural race well, and now that you've finally reached the end, we can confidently say that you are two of the most deserving people of this olive branch as you have successfully expanded the worlds of 387 students over this 14-year journey. Janet, we will always remember your favorite saying and hope this gift will be a reminder to you as well, to live like an olive tree, living, forgiving, and free. Thank you both for blessing each one of us, and we pray that whatever the coming years may hold, they will be full of joy, adventure, and peace. We love you guys.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we are going to finish up with a hymn, typical Mennonite style. So if you guys would like to join us, we're going to be singing number 2 in the Green Book. So we'll sing the first verse as is, and then we'll repeat it. But instead of saying the journey is long, we'll use an iteration that Janet taught us, in which we say the journey is home. Come walk with us, the journey is long. 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 The journey, the journey, 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 the journey is long. Come walk with us, the journey is home. 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 The journey, the journey, 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 the journey is home. Thank you all very much for coming, and now you're free to go or stay as you wish.